Hi, everyone. I'm Natasha Darchi, Maryland State Public Defender, and I welcome you to this informational session where Deputy Public Defender for Baltimore City, Alycia Capozello, will take us through the life of a case through the Maryland Juvenile Court system. I ask that if you have any questions at the very end, if time allows, we will take some questions. Or in the alternative, you'll have our contact information at the end. Please forward any and all questions you may have to one of the individuals, either myself, Ms. Capozello, or a member of our legislative team. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deputy District Public Defender Alycia Capozello.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Public Defender. Again, my name is Alycia Capozello. I'm Deputy Public Defender for Baltimore City. But before I assumed that role about 18 months ago, I was a youth defender. I represented children in Baltimore City Juvenile Court for the Office of the Public Defender for over 20 years, and I loved it. It was a calling for me. So it is my pleasure to present to you this evening Life of a Case through the Maryland court system, the juvenile court system. And my hope is that this presentation will provide a framework for you to have fruitful youth justice discussions and to consider proposed legislation. So with that, we can get started with the presentation. There are several examples of how a child will enter the juvenile court system. One way is through a citizen or an agency filing a complaint about the child with the Maryland Department of Juvenile Services. Another mechanism for a child to come into the juvenile court system is through a law enforcement officer filing a report about the child with the Department of Juvenile Services. But the third way a child enters the system, and by far the most common way, is the child is actually arrested by the police. So here we have Bart and Milhouse. They are two friends who are about to go through the juvenile justice system. They are both 15 years old. In our case, they are accused of robbing someone with a gun. Armed robbery. And I just want to take a moment to say that we were very thoughtful about the type of case that we chose to present to you today. We chose armed robbery because we think it will best illustrate the various points in the life of a case. But it's important to note that these cases are the minority of the cases in which we represent young people and in which young people come into the system. In fact, for fiscal year 2023, 65% of the young people who entered the juvenile court system were charged with lesser offenses, were charged with misdemeanor offenses. And so this is a rare example, but again, one we think that will be illustrative. So Bart and Milhouse are accused of robbing someone with a gun. No gun is recovered. The boys fit the description given by the victim of the robbery suspects, and the police then stop them for a possible identification. They're identified. The victim identifies both boys as being the people who committed the robbery. Milhouse is specifically identified as the person who held the gun and asked for the money. Bart is specifically identified as standing about 10 feet away from where the events occurred, looking around in all directions and appearing to the victim scared. So again, the primary ways that a juvenile complaint is made and how a child enters the juvenile justice system is through police and an on-view arrest. Again, this is the majority of cases, and or through a citizen's complaint. So once the boys have been placed under arrest, they go through a full booking process. by the police, and then they're physically presented to the Department of Juvenile Services. At that point, the Department of Juvenile Services takes over in the process. They have what's called an intake process. And a couple of decisions are made by the Department of Juvenile Services during this intake process. The first is whether or not the case will be forwarded to the state's attorney's office for charging. And the second decision that is made is the detention status of the boys. So we'll take each one in turn. In these cases, the Department of Juvenile Services, using its intake assessment process, has decided to forward charges against both boys to the state's attorney's office. Now, had the Department of Juvenile Services wanted to take another route, had they decided not to forward the cases for charging, but rather handle the cases through informal adjustment, which is also known as diversion, because this is a crime of violence, because armed robbery is a crime of violence, DJS would have been required to forward that decision to the state's attorney's office for its approval. And at that point, the state's attorney's office could have said, no, we're rejecting this case being handled informally. We are going to file formal charges against Bart and Milhouse. Informal adjustment or diversion can take various forms. It can take the form of restitution being paid to a victim. It can take the form of a restorative circle where the children sit down with the victim in a case and talk about how the incident impacted everybody and figure out ways to make everybody whole. It can take the form of community service. It can take the form of mental health treatment or substance abuse treatment. There is an array of interventions and services that can be provided to children without pulling them into the formal court system. But in this instance, for this particular case, again, DJS has decided to forward the cases to the state's attorney's office for charging. The state's attorney's office then decides to file charges in both cases through delinquency petitions. The second decision that is made during this DJS intake process is the detention status of the children. The Department of Juvenile Services makes this decision through a risk assessment tool called the Detention Risk Assessment Instrument. That looks at a number of objective factors, but it also has some overrides built in. And in this case, for armed robbery, under current DJS policy, armed robbery is a case in which the decision will be detention. It is what's called a mandatory hold. Both Milhouse and Bart will be detained until they see the court the next court day. So Milhouse and Bart appear before the court the next court day, and this hearing is typically called a juvenile arraignment. A number of things happen at this first court hearing, this first court appearance. Milhouse and Bart will have an attorney with them. It very likely will be an assistant public defender. The Office of the Public Defender represents the vast majority of children who are charged in Maryland juvenile courts. The assigned attorney will enter their appearance. The children will receive a copy of the official charging document called the petition. And the children will enter a plea of not guilty. In the rare instance, a child may enter a plea of guilty, but again, that's a rarity. And the court will set a trial date. The final and perhaps most important thing that happens at a juvenile arraignment is the judge determines each child's detention status pending trial. And this portion of the arraignment is called the detention hearing. At the arraignment, the child faces numerous outcomes that affect their liberty. The judge could release the child to their parent or another caregiver with no supervision from the court or DJS. The court could place a child on what's called an alternative to detention. There are an array of alternatives to detention. The most common is called community detention. Community detention is essentially house arrest. The court could place the child in an evening reporting center program where the child will be picked up after school, transported to a program to do pro-social positive activities, have a meal together, and then be transported home. And those programs operate daily. The court could place a child in a shelter care, most typically a group home, more rarely a foster home. And then finally, the court could could detain a child in a secure detention facility. This is a jail. So how does the court make this decision? Well, first, the court has a standard that it's held to. In order for the court to detain a child, to separate that child from their family and place them in a jail, the court must find that the child is a risk to themselves or to others, or is a risk of flight. The court will consider an array of factors to make this decision, such as the nature of the charges in the petition, the child's previous offense history, any recommendations that come from the Department of Juvenile Services, the recommendation of the state's attorney's office and the defense attorney, and finally, input from the parents. What happens to Milhouse and Bart? Well, at their hearings the next day, the assistant state's attorney argues that both Milhouse and Bart should be detained pending trial. Based largely upon his role in the robbery, which we talked about a little bit earlier, the court orders Milhouse detained. Based on his lesser alleged role in the robbery, his lack of prior offenses, and the support available to him at home, the court orders Bart placed on community detention. The court then sets what's called an adjudicatory hearing, which is a trial, and that is scheduled within 30 days. So between the arraignment and the trial, there are an array of things that happen. There are an array of activities that Bart and Milhouse's attorneys take on behalf of them. And so what we need to remember is that many of the young people, many of the children that we represent are factually innocent. But for those that aren't, they have a constitutional right to a trial and a vigorous defense. And we at the Maryland Office of the Public Defender take all of that incredibly seriously. And so the preparation and investigation that we are doing occurs within those 30 days. We are reviewing all of the discovery, all of the information that must be provided to us from law enforcement, from the police and from the state's attorney's office. That takes the form of body-worn camera footage, police body-worn camera footage, perhaps other surveillance videos, recorded witness statements, police reports, drug reports, DNA, phone records, police misconduct records. Some of that we receive automatically from the state's attorney's office, but much of it we are affirmatively seeking out ourselves. We also proactively investigate the cases ourselves by visiting crime scenes, taking photographs at crime scenes, interviewing witnesses, subpoenaing those witnesses, preparing those witnesses to testify. They could be fact witnesses. We also have the resources to retain expert witnesses on behalf of our child clients. We also file pretrial motions on behalf of our clients. So the 30 days are up, and now it is the day of adjudication. It is the trial date for a child. This is the hearing at which the prosecution, the state's attorney's office, must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. At the adjudicatory hearing, there are several ways that cases proceed. One way is the state's attorney's office dismisses the cases. This is because they have insufficient evidence to proceed against the child. A second way that the case may proceed is through mutual postponement. A mutual postponement is when the attorneys on both sides, the assistant state's attorney and the defense attorney, come together and agree to postpone the trial date for the child to fulfill certain agreed upon conditions. Those conditions are very much like the conditions that could be offered to a child prior to involvement in the court system back at the DJS intake stage. So again, payment of restitution, completion of a treatment program or a school activity. If the child successfully completes the conditions, the agreed upon conditions, then the state agrees to dismiss the case against the child. A third way that the state may proceed is through an admission, commonly known as a guilty plea, where the child admits to involvement in the offense without a trial. And then fourth, a trial. So what do our boys do in this case example? Milhouse decides to admit to robbery. Milhouse, after talking with his defense attorney, consulting with his family, reflecting upon his own behavior, accepts responsibility, and decides that he does not want to put his grandmother with whom he lives through the stress of a trial. Bart requests a trial. A trial takes place, and at the close of the trial, the court finds Bart fact sustained, which is juvenile court language for guilty. Remember, the victim described Bart as being about 10 feet away from the incident, looking around in all directions, appearing scared. And after hearing all of the evidence, the magistrate believes that Bart was actively involved in the robbery. So at that point, both Milhouse and Bart have been found fact sustained of robbery. The next step in the life of a juvenile case is for the court to schedule what's called a disposition hearing, which is similar to a sentencing hearing. At the disposition, the court has several options available to it. One option is to place the child on probation. If a child is placed on probation, a child will be assigned a Department of Juvenile Services case manager who will oversee their supervision. That case manager will make appropriate referrals to various services that the court deems will be helpful in the child's rehabilitation. During the term of probation, the case manager will also write memos to the court, updating the court on the child's progress under supervision. Children face a set term of probation depending upon the seriousness of the offense and other factors. I want to point out here that in our case, for Milhouse and Bart, they've been accused and found fact sustained of armed robbery. Because of the seriousness of the charges, the court is able to place Bart and Milhouse on as long a term of probation as the court sees fit. During the life of any probation, if a child is not progressing well, the Department of Juvenile Services may file a violation of probation petition that is then heard before the court. The court decides then if the child is in fact in violation of probation and can take appropriate steps thereafter. However, even if a violation of probation petition is not filed, the court has some freedom to extend or modify the probation based on the court's own review of the circumstances. The court will regularly hold hearings during the course of probation to review how a child is doing. So that's probation. The second option that the court has is to commit the child to the Department of Juvenile Services. That's a very serious step to take. And what it means is that the court is granting the Department of Juvenile Services custody over the child and allowing that child to be placed outside of their home and separated from their family in a residential placement. The court may specify what types of placements the Department of Juvenile Services may use for that particular child. And there are an array of placements varying in security and services provided. But again, it's a separation of the child from their family. So that is the life of a juvenile court case in Maryland. I'm happy to answer any questions at this time.
If there are no questions during this presentation, again, individual will have the opportunity to reach out to a member of the team with any specific questions that you may have.